book launch event of the Maud Perrier's book entitled Childcare Struggles, Maternal Workers and then Social Reproduction. This book, if you are joining this event, you get a 50% off code on the website you joined. So if you haven't purchased, please have a look. Think about the purchase of this fantastic book. It is my honor to chair the launch of this powerful, sincere, and path-breaking book. And we have eminent speakers at the panel today. And so I would like to briefly introduce them, highlighting their work closely related to Maud's book. So firstly, Professor Bridget Anderson is a professor of migration, mobility, and studentship and the director of Migration Mobility Institute at the University of Bristol. She has published many influential books, including Doing the Dirty Work, The Global Politics of Domestic Labor in 2000, and also with Isabel Schutz, The Migration and the Care Labor Theory, Policy, and Politics in 2014. Also, we have Professor Susan Ferguson, is a Marxist feminist scholar and activist and associate professor emeritus at the Wilfrid Laurier University, Canada, teaching youth and children's studies, digital media, and journalism. She has published widely on social reproduction theory, children's culture and education, and the democratic discourse in academic journals, including Women and Work, Social Reproduction, Feminism, and Labor in 2020. And finally, Professor Helen Penn is a visiting professor at the UCL Institute of Education and a professor emeritus at the University of East London. She was joint founder of the International Center for the Study of the Mixed Market Economy, which has focused on the privatization of childcare. She has published extensively on early education and childcare policies, and most recently, she has been a co-author of the Nuffield-funded report, Equations and Mergers and Debt, the New Language of Childcare, which focused on financialization of childcare and company childcare provision. And of course, the author of the book, Dr. Maud Perrier, who is an expert on mothering, gender, class, and childcare in the neoliberal economies. She has used a range of qualitative methodologies, including archives, to investigate care and then gender inequalities in the UK, Australia, Canada, and then beyond. Today, firstly, we will have a short introduction of the book by Maud herself. Then we will hear each speaker's comment, the order of Bridget and Helen and Susan. And then Maud will make short response to the comments. There will be a good amount of time for question and answer in the second part of today's event. So please think about questions. And if you want to start typing the question in the chat, please do so. Okay, Maud, please start.
Thank you, Junko, for this warm and generous introduction. And good to see everyone here today. It means a lot that you've made the time to come. So I'm going to start by reading the first 4 sentences of the book, and then I'm going to say why I think maternal worker as a concept has something to offer for rethinking the present and the future of childcare struggles. Childcare labor continues to be some of the lowest paid work in society and is disproportionately performed by working class, migrant, and racialized minority women. The large-scale entry of middle-class women into paid work continues to rely on the low value attributed to the labor of economically marginalized women who care for their children. Childcare is subject to intense policy scrutiny from neoliberal governments, yet workers, especially those in the lowest paid jobs in the informal sector, are rarely at the table in these discussions. So the class and racialized divisions in paid childcare continue to pose an ethical, practical, and political challenge to 21st century feminism. This book returns to a well-rehearsed debate about feminist divisions and solidarities by offering a distinctive framework that theorizes maternal workers as both divided and yet connected through comparative case studies of workers in 3 distinct sectors. So this is how the book starts, and I'm going to try and tell you very, very briefly how a focus on maternal workers can help us to redress the way that child rearing is individualized and privatized. Firstly, the term aims to critique the twin cultural idealization of white middle-class mothering and the invisibilization of low-wage childcare workers. So in the book, I use a particular type of social reproduction theory to show how both work-based and community-based organizing are fundamental parts of childcare struggles without hierarchizing them, without seeing them as separate. The term also redresses the lack of vocabulary to politicize the class and racialized divisions in wage childcare work, and invites us to better understand divisions and cultivate solidarity across them. The term also challenges the way that mainstream policy, academic, and public discussions continue to frame childcare as a liberal feminist fight for middle-class women to have more time to work, and neglects working class and migrant women's struggle to nurture and empower their communities. Finally, the term maternal worker tries to address the way that social movement literature, in its definitions of solidarity, overemphasizes sameness and similarity through an account of what I call differentiated solidarity. The second attempt of the book is to avoid a particularly well-rehearsed way that the relationship between neoliberalism and feminism is framed. So rather than seeing them as locked in a dialectic of resistance and cooptation, I focus on how activists and groups are involved in both fightbacks and setbacks in securing publicly funded childcare, collective bargaining rights, and higher wages. To do this, I bring to light the distinctive repertoires of organizing of the workers I interviewed, which I call maternal worker praxis, and show how techniques like contracts, worker assemblies, strikes enabled with parent solidarity, and testimonials are developed to do this. And I show that there are significant barriers to establishing solidarity, both across and within these groups of waged and unwaged care workers, including deepening urban divisions and professionalization policies that exclude non-citizen workers. But at the heart of each of these barriers, it is liberal individual definitions of empowerment which form the biggest barrier, and which I argue can only be decentered by focusing on collective worker power. Okay, Junko, I think I'm going to leave it there for other speakers to tell us what they thought.
Brilliant. Thank you, Maud, for the introduction by the author of the book. And we would like to move on to the Bridget comment. Bridget, please.
Yeah, thanks, Junko, and thanks, Maud. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about this fantastic book. I really enjoyed reading it, and I really learned a lot from it, partly because I have to admit, I haven't actually worked on this area for a few years, so it was kind of taking me back to my roots, I guess. And what struck me was how Junko used the word sincere, and I think that there is something about the way in which it's written from unashamedly, really, from a point of view. And I think that's, you know, a value and a challenge of the work that that Maud's done. And I kind of was thinking, oh, you can't help, in my experience of working on this field, you can't help but look at it from your point of view. And I think while being conscious of not wanting to sort of reinstantiate a binary gender divide, and I know that I'm putting this really simplistically, but in my experience of talking about domestic work and childcare work, basically there's quite often a kind of gender divide, with men being quite defensive, saying, actually, I do more than my fair share, or, oh, look at all these so-called feminists buying themselves out their problems by oppressing their sisters. And women kind of sort of also with a certain share of defensiveness. And I know from having kind of written peer-reviewed articles on this, seeing sometimes the peer reviewing coming back and sort of being quite defensive, but also I remember, because I used to be involved quite closely in a support group for migrant domestic workers, and I remember really well kind of going off to London on Sundays with 1 or 2 kids in tow to support domestic workers, and then feeling like wanting to say, I know that it's really hard work, but I'm also exhausted too. And I think that's one of the things that Maud kind of addresses really well, because, you know, I then felt really embarrassed about just hearing in a kind of conversation, hearing my kind of middle class sort of tone, like, oh no, but you're not the only one who's tired, and wanting to think about, well, how can I as a middle class mum find this kind of shared interest, and feeling sometimes stymied when some workers, reflecting what Maud describes as a differential access to the categories of mother and worker, would dismiss their female employers for working, saying, you know, I'm a migrant, I went abroad to work because I had to. If I was as wealthy as my female employer, then I would have stayed at home and looked after my children properly. Also, I found kind of it difficult when more recently in work that I've done, working with looking at migrant workers in Thailand and Malaysia who are working as care workers, saying that they actively were choosing to work for lower wages because they wanted to be with a family that treated them as part of the family rather than as contractual workers. Now, so for me, this was quite a kind of different experience than the experience that I had working with migrant domestic workers in the UK, who were, as more documents, actively resisting kind of being treated as part of the family, you know, saying, you know, demanding contracts, demanding to be called workers rather than helpers. And to then be kind of met with people who were saying, well, that because they felt that if they were given a contract, that this was going to tie them to an employer, that it wasn't, that a contract was not a guarantee of terms and conditions, and that actually it was better to be with employers that you've liked, and indeed preferring to work irregularly, because that would also mean that you weren't tied to employers with the attendant required pregnancy tests and immigration control. So this kind of quite different contexts. And I was thinking, when Maud was talking about solidarity, how kind of sometimes I think that indeed what some of those workers were kind of seeking or looking for was in fact a form of solidarity that then got kind of swallowed up in the language of the familial. So I think that the idea of maternal worker is indeed a really helpful one and a very useful one. And I think it also shows us the difficulty, and we can see this in Maud's book, is the difficulty of acting ethically, of the ways in which, you know, we are trapped in systems. I always remember talking to an au pair who was working for a single mum and who was doing the single mum was doing shift work as a care assistant in the NHS, and she couldn't afford to pay childcare. She couldn't afford to pay for minimum wage. So she was employing an au pair. And the au pair said to me, she was desperate to leave, but she felt so sorry for the mum. She said, well, she's not going to be able to manage without me. And I think that kind of what Maud talks about as depletion, I think is a very powerful depiction of the sorts of binds that women find themselves in when they do actually recognize our interdependence and mutual responsibilities, and that mutuality and interdependence, which should be energizing, but is often only used to say, well, if you're not like this, you're selfish, and if you are, well, you're depleted. So I think it is a really powerful analysis. And I just wanted to end by saying that, you know, speaking from my own position, and I think one of the great things about the book is its reflexivity and thinking about how my response is shaped by my position, and my position has indeed changed. So when I was working around domestic work and childcare, I had kids. Now I'm in the throes of elder care, and I have to say it's kind of different and yet similar. It's exhausting, unthinkably expensive, even less socialized, and in stratified care labor is very poorly positioned. So there was really, I think, you know, while, as Maud says, childcare, middle-class women's challenge with childcare did get some discussion in the pandemic, actually there was very little discussion, I think, about elder and disability care at home. And so I think that for this too, we need the kind of joined up thinking and politics that centers solidarities and interdependence, and that Maud writes so powerfully about. So exactly, so we don't end up depleted and divided. So it's a fantastic book. I'd really recommend it to everyone. And I'd also say, can we have some more, please, Maud? Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Bridget. I think the really highlighting that key sort of message of the Maud, those who haven't read the book, but also the expanding that potential of that Maud's book to the wider area related to care. So we would like to move on to Helen, please, next. Yeah.
Well, I was very pleased to be asked to introduce this book, since my whole life has been about childcare struggles, both personally and professionally. I've been involved in thinking about finding, providing, running and critiquing childcare services, and also mothering and grandparenting for a very long time. And most recently, I've been trying to track the role big business has come to have in delivering childcare. That is, how the processes of financing childcare and the extraction of profits has altered the shape of childcare services in the way it already has done with healthcare and other essential services. It's hard not to be pessimistic about this process of financialization and the immoral conversion of care into calculable assets for investors. When I was part of the feminist campaign, the National Childcare Campaign, to improve childcare in the 1970s and 1980s, it seemed to us axiomatic that there was a continuum between mothering and collective childcare. Because we were mothers, we knew that looking after and educating young children was a complex and demanding process, and we wanted to find ways of defining, sharing, and participating in some kind of collective childcare. The solidarity between mothers and childcare workers seemed to us then to be self-evident. Being a mother and being a childcare worker was an exchangeable and mutual experience. And our solution was to try and develop community nurseries in which tasks could be carried out and the burden, if indeed it is a burden, of looking after children could be shared. We also tried to define what that work was, and then we got into the old psychological dictum of how children learn and develop, and so on. It's not a good route to go down, really. This vision of collectivity, shared work and shared benefits has long since disappeared. And Maud's book is an attempt to address some of the obstacles in the way of awakening it. She highlights the stratified nature of society, the visibility of middle-class mothers who need time to pursue their careers and who are vocal about their childcare problems, and contrast this with the invisibility of poor mothers whose lives are a constant strain. She uses the term depletion to try to describe the ways in which poor women's lives have become more and more difficult because of the shriveling of state funding and the increasingly neoliberal cast of society. She emphasizes the near impossibility of women on low incomes, especially migrant women, of finding ways to make ends meet, and of the strain and anxiety of their lives, and on their children's lives, of course, as a result. When we set up the National Childcare Campaign, we acknowledged we were less sympathetic to childminders because we thought home-based care was too isolating and was an unsatisfactory option. And we left out nannies altogether. Nannies have been the preferred solution for upper-class women for a very long time, hiring out the dirtier jobs of childcare, but maintaining the fiction that an hour or so of mother's time in a day was worth more to a child than 10 hours a day of nanny's time. And I don't know whether any of you have read it, but the French-Algerian writer, Leila Slimani, has written a devastating book, The Perfect Nanny, which has also become a bestseller, in which the needs and the families of the nanny, the needs and feelings of the nanny, and the nanny's own position as a mother was so overlooked by her employers that she ends up killing the children in her charge. And the book cruelly exposes the hypocrisies and tensions in nannying. I know from my stays in South Africa that the domestic black nanny from the township underpinned almost all middle-class life. The domestic my daughter used had a child back in the township who she saw only during her brief holiday. When I remonstrated with my daughter, she said, "But we all do it." Damon Galbert's Booker Prize-winning novel, The Promise, also focuses on the treatment of the black domestic come nanny in a white farming family, and subtly contrasts the fate of the nanny's own son with that of the children she looked after. So as Maud points out, nannying has to be part of the childcare narrative, not least because it is so often black and migrant women who carry the burden of this very unequal childcare arrangement. Given that the fault lines of class, race, and of a neoliberalism which devalues all state solutions are now so entrenched, what can be done? Well, one of Maud's suggestions is that the very language of childcare should be rewritten in order to emphasize the solidarity of all women who look after children, mothers as well as paid workers. And she coins the phrase maternal workers. And she also explores how unionization might work and how solidarities might be expressed across the maternal worker spectrum by reviving the idea of community-based childcare, for example. She also argues that it's reasonable, if not essential, to demand state funding to underpin maternal work, as she defines it. That is, not subsidising middle-class mothers through voucher schemes and childcare entitlements, as it does currently in the UK and many other countries, but directly finding community solutions. And sociologists and academics have a role too in uncovering the contradictions and inequalities of present arrangements, which COVID to an extent highlighted. One of the aspects of growing old and looking back is that you become more pessimistic as you think about what has been tried before and has failed. But really, there's no alternative to optimism. Things have to get better, and Maud's book is an important step on the road. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen, so much about your comment, the historical, personal, and academic insights about the collective and individualized child care, but also the strong positive notes at the end of your comment, which I think reflect that tone of the Maud book as well. So we would like to move to Sue now. Would you please start your comment?
Yes, thank you. And yeah, thank you, Maud, for inviting me to engage with this wonderful book. Thank you, Junko, for all your work and kind of herding us together, and Bridget and Helen for those really rich comments based so much in your experiences. So I found them really fascinating and interesting. I'm going to read my comments as just because I'm worried I'm going to be going over time. I don't think I will. I think I'll be close to time, but anyway, here we go. So I want to start by saying this is an incredibly important and impressive book that I think everyone concerned with the politics of childcare struggles should read. As so should everyone concerned with the politics of the labor movement more generally. And I think that's because Maud's developed a methodology that can be fruitfully applied to workers' struggles more generally. So I focused my comments here on what I believe the book achieves specifically in relation to the growing body of work that's situated within what we might call a renewed field of social reproduction studies. And that's because my area is the social reproduction theory, thinking through sort of the theoretical framework for those studies. But I want to at least start by mentioning, the many achievements of this book as a whole. And I see childcare struggles, maternal workers, and social reproduction working at a variety of levels. First, it's a rich sociological analysis of workers' struggles. Maud has excelled, I think, at recounting and dissecting the local inflections and dilemmas that people trying to shift the very contours of the social power that they confront in their day-to-day activities confront. And she moves elegantly between these concrete facts on the one hand and a coherent and yet expansive sociological framework that attends to questions of class, race, gender, and colonialism on the other. It's really sophisticated work, I think. Second, it's an exemplary model of scholarly research guided by activism. That is research that seeks to learn with those in struggle by listening for and foregrounding the workers' own experiences today. And more than that, and this really did impress me, Maud also brings these experiences of today, contemporary experiences, into conversation with what is a way too long history of childcare struggles. I mean, 50 years, when you think about it, how difficult is it to have decent childcare? But for 50 years, people have been really struggling around this issue. So she takes the contemporary activities and struggles and puts them into conversation with the many women mostly who have come before people today in order to compare, but also in order to retrieve and adapt relevant lessons. Third, it's a timely and necessary critique of scholarly siloing of knowledge production, one that urges sociology to reconsider childcare and family through the lens of labor. And I think in doing this, Maud really shows how something like the lens of labor can lead to a really interdisciplinary, multiply layered complex analysis, which is, I think, a very important tool for people who want to wed scholarly research with political activism. Fourth, it is a work of theory that draws on in order to innovate the conceptual apparatus of social reproduction, while reminding the field as a whole how important it is for theory to be grounded in the concrete realities of workers' everyday lives and struggles. And I'm particularly impressed by Maud's commitment to and deployment of a truly dialectical, historical, materialist methodology. And I'll talk a bit more about that. For it is this, I think, that leads to the book's central innovation, which is, of course, the proposal to consider childcare labor through the lens of maternal workers. Fifth, it's a timely and important political intervention into a cresting wave of resistance to capitalist forms of social reproductive labor. The term maternal workers does a lot of heavy lifting, not only conceptually, but politically. And I think in outlining that work that the term does, Maud has laid down a bit of a challenge for other sectors of social reproductive labor, say in healthcare or in teaching, to consider if there might be a similarly broader political subject around which real solidarity can be built in those sectors too. So that's my kind of bullet point list of the 5 things that really stood out to me, standout achievements of this wonderful book. The rest of my comments now will expand on the last 2 points about how the book's theoretical and political strengths contribute to building a more robust field of social reproduction studies. So the renewed theorization of social reproduction that I've been involved in, and that so that's also work that's been happening within social reproduction theory, but also within autonomous influenced social reproduction critiques, distinguishes itself from much of the earlier theorizations of social reproduction by explicitly grappling with anti-racist and other feminist critiques who called out the earlier social reproduction theory for its more singular and focus on domestic labor as a site of gender oppression as narrow and exclusionary. And so myself and others have devoted some ink to trying to think through what it would mean for a social reproduction framework to be stretched to accommodate that robust critique. Key to that rethinking has been our attempt to insist that the work of reproducing this and the next generation of workers is not only organized in households, but also in communities and state agencies, and it's also commercialized. This positions social reproduction labor as an expansive and complex form of work, shaped in and through not just gender relations, but also in relation to the fuller set of oppressive relations that bear on our sociality, the racial, cis heterosexual, settler colonial, and other oppressive forces and dynamics. As well, our rethinking has stressed that social reproductive work varies in its relation to capitalist forms of accumulation. It's not all placed in the same relation to capital. It's both waged and unwaged, and it takes place in public and private settings. So revising the theoretical scaffolding of the social reproduction perspective matters both to grasp the specific nature of capitalist forms of life-making work, and more pointedly, to better figure out how to organize against the capitalist tendencies to undermine our life-making capacities. So Maud's study here slices off one crucial and wide-ranging element of the overall processes of social reproduction, that of childcare. And it digs deeply and carefully into how that work really happens within a context of capitalist pressures to devalue and deplete the conditions of that work. And even more significantly, she examines what resistance to those pressures actually looks like on the ground, what demands workers put forward, how they do and do not imagine and go about building solidarity with others, and where their political energies are focused. So in bringing into view and placing side by side the concrete experiences, the perceived needs, and the politics of paid childcare workers in contemporary cooperatively run centers, parents who are clients of such centers, migrant in-home childcare workers who are organized and those who are not, mompreneurs who offer maternal support services and unpaid maternal support workers and community organizers. I may have left some out here, but you really get a very rich feeling of the different types of maternal workers by reading this book. So in placing those experiences side by side, Maud unearths ideological and organizational dynamics among maternal workers that pit them against each other to some degree, while also identifying those social forces that make it possible to draw lines of connection amongst them. So this is an original and deft analysis, one that fulfills the promise of dialectics in that it presents the particular experience of workers in different sectors and different social locations as the in Marxist terms would be the concrete determination of an inclusive and coherent, if contradictory, whole or unity. So I'll try to unpack that a little bit. Maud's unique and important contribution is to conceptualize that unity as the maternal worker. But it's not just the name that matters here. It's not just that we're calling them something else. It is the fact that, as Maud emphasizes, the maternal worker is situated in this intractable contradiction of capitalist production and social reproduction. And this is really messy and tricky political terrain. The experiences, interests, and needs of migrant nannies and mompreneurs, or of paid childcare workers and their client parents, not only diverge, they also regularly clash, as Maud stresses. But as moments of a shared, complex reality, that of being a maternal worker facing down capital's relentless depletion of resources and energies for social reproduction, these people's struggles are also recognizable to each other, right? Beginning our analytic and political tasks by insisting upon this unity of the diverse is critical if we are to build the sort of solidarity required to make childcare and the work of social reproduction more generally a priority of society and not its afterthought. At the same time, and this is a really crucial point, that unity is not pre-given. There is no maternal worker identity that the broad range of social reproductive workers Maud interviews naturally attach themselves to. And there are not even at this point any maternal worker organizations, as far as I know, at least in the sense that Maud has outlined. Such a class subject, a subject who can drive history forward through class struggle, must be consciously constructed. It doesn't just exist. And it will not be brought into being by academics, unfortunately, as Maud well knows. In fact, she politely notes, academics tend to invoke the term solidarity without also offering adequate, and this is Maud's term, analytical precision with regard to the practices that enable relationships to thrive in time-poor capitalist societies. That is so true. It's true of myself and others. And so this is also why her book is so valuable. For Maud identifies a series of real and abiding obstacles to building solidarity through her fieldwork with maternal workers in struggle. She considers these dilemmas and how workers do and do not succeed in addressing them as a reason to stress what she calls a sociologically grounded concept of solidarity. And this involves, if I've understood Maud well, learning with workers in struggle what the limits to solidarity are, and then conceptualizing those limits through the rubric of what we know about the racialized, gendered, and class-divided relations that organize social reproductive work in capitalist societies. Only from this vantage point, then, can we begin to see and forge some common ground on which struggles can advance. That common ground, she proposes, emerges from the shared experience of depletion of resources, personal, financial, structural, for social reproduction. But she also, and this is also important, argues that such solidarity must begin with centering the issues of the most marginalized sector, migrant and immigrant nannies. These are overwhelmingly women of color who contend with racist immigration laws, racist policing of their communities, and minimally regulated conditions of work, while often being denied the right and resources to care for their own children and their own communities. These women must be at the core of the a maternal worker's consciousness and a political agenda that grows from that consciousness, because, Maud argues, they are the maternal workers who bear the fullest burden of capital's reluctant dependence, to use Tithi Bhattacharya's apt formulation, on the labors of life-making. That is, capital's reluctantly dependent upon the labors of life-making. So this book is thus, I think, a rich and powerful example of how the social reproduction theory framework can help make sense of the world, while also a serious and exciting innovation on that framework and its political potential. So I really want to congratulate you, Maud, for writing it. I really think it's a wonderful book. I do have 3 questions that I'll just pose if if you don't mind, and if you get to them, great. If not, that's fine. So the first was the goals of maternal worker power. You write in a couple of places near the end of the book, are collectively owned and socialized forms of childcare provision, policies, and infrastructures. Elsewhere, you write about it as a mixture of worker and publicly owned services with connections to communities, unions, and social movements. So these goals would clearly strain, if they were to be achieved, they would clearly strain the current capitalist organization of social reproduction, and certainly would involve militant confrontation with the state, and possibly with capital too, if, for instance, private childcare centers were all of a sudden to be socialized. So I just wondered if you might elaborate on if and or how you see the politics and maternal worker struggles fitting with a wider anti-capitalist politics. So that was one question. Second question, I found your discussion of NGOs in the Mumpreneur chapter. Really interesting and a little unsettling, precisely because the literature that critiques NGOization of development in the global south points to how tightly tied NGOs can be to local ruling classes in the state. And I think you acknowledge as much. But do you think there's something distinct about maternal worker NGOs that perhaps circumvents some of those concerns? And how does one go about working with NGOs to get past kind of the political traps of their funding models? So that's a pretty big question, and I don't really expect you to have the exact answer to that, but I'm just would love to hear your views on it. And then another question that this is maybe a little bit out of left field, I don't know. I'm curious about the children who use the services that you write about. You mentioned that some children supported the strike actions in the Australian centers. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about whether you think there's more research that could be done about children's own involvement in organizing the conditions of their care and what that might look like. So those are my questions. And again, thank you and congratulations on the book. I think it's fabulous.
Thank you so much about your thorough and precise unpacking of the theoretical and then political contribution that's Maud argument in this book make to social reproduction theory, and also the reality and the life of maternal workers. Maud, would you like to come back and give some response to the comments from the Bridget and Helen and Sue, and possibly some response to the Sue's questions posed at the end?
Thank you, Junko. I'm really heartened and moved by your really generous responses, Bridget, Helen, and Sue. So I think I actually need a minute to compose myself, Junko. And since Bridget raised the question of solidarity with care workers beyond childcare, Junko, I wonder if you had any reflections based on your own research of studying both childcare and elderly care, whilst I try and get myself together.
Okay, okay, so I will do that then. I think it can be might be question to Maud. Sorry to go back to you, but I thought that it's quite interesting you departed from the concept of care, which can be include both the childcare and elderly care, and then the care for people with disabilities, to focus on maternal workers. And that is I read as a political decision. But it's also the segregating the childcare from other types of care. And then whether I think that's the tension is there, always has been historically, whether we should unite the care workers or we should acknowledge the difference in the different field of care. And then whether you see it as sorry to give it more questions, but I think it's quite interesting that do we need to think, like Bridget suggested, that do we need another version of the elderly care workers struggle, or could this maternal workers struggle could be expanded to other type of care or not, is the interesting question. And I thought that's maybe my question I need to think. But because of the structural forces, the oppressive forces, particularly for you focus on the depletion and then capitalist system, that your maternal workers theoretical framework can be extended to the elderly care workers struggle. And but that would be a quite interesting theoretical questions, whether it's possible or not, and if not, why not? And then I can't answer that, I think, at this moment. But
Okay.
yeah. So that's my response. Would you like to go ahead, Maud? Or
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. Okay, so two things come to mind. The first is perhaps sort of related to what Sue was saying, that I tried to build theory based on these specific empirical cases of maternal workers and of the similarities and differences in workers who either look after children or support mothers. So that was, I think, I would need to know more about the specific conditions and the organizing practices of care workers in elderly care and other care sectors to think about how that might, apply or how it might need revising and changing. Secondly, I think it was a deliberate choice to think about social reproduction rather than care, and to center social reproduction as a way of thinking about stratification, especially alongside race and class. And in doing that, lots of people have contributed to the way that my thinking around that shifted. One of those people is Pramila Nadesan, who I think might be here, but their work on social reproduction and how the terminology of care was care policies, whether the parental leave or other types of care policies, were developed through middle-class women's activism. And so the way that she traces those histories was really important to making me think about how the concept of care was going to be insufficient in what I was trying to do, both theoretically and politically. Yes, so that's sort of like a short answer to your question, Junko. And then maybe I'd like to say a few words, I think, about how Bridget, Helen, and Sue's work has fueled and influenced the writing of this book, and how that's sort of embedded in the arguments that I was trying to make. And maybe then I can return to Sue's questions. So first of all, when I read Doing the Dirty Work, I think that's when I really sort of my thinking about what binds, I think that word bind is really important, Bridget, how it changed how I was trying to think about solidarity and division, and trying to understand it in a way that was sharp, but that wasn't also silencing some of the middle class particulars around childcare. And importantly, I think it's that book that made me think about how being a non-citizen and being migrant worker changed some of the questions that needed to be asked about not just about solidarity, but about how having a relationship, a direct relationship with one's employers, changes, the sort of activism, the sort of social movement strategies that were open to workers in the informal sector. And Helen, your work has also deeply influenced the writing of this book. Both your memoir of being a childcare early years education researcher, which is titled Be Realistic, Demand the Impossible. What a wonderful title. And your most recent co-authored report about the financialization of the childcare sector, which is entitled Acquisition, Mergers and Debts. And both this research and other on the way that the financialization of childcare, the way that I think I read that up to 15% of childcare providers in the UK today are owned by multinational companies that are not actually based in the UK, and how there is a correlation between this growth and the failures of care, the way that there are more and more incidents of not just workers' exploitation, but of the lack of care, that's the quality of the care that's given to children. So I think that report and your writing more generally fueled a sense of the urgency of what's happening right now and how that contributes to making the conditions for collective bargaining, for unionization, more and more difficult in the formal childcare sector in the UK especially, but more broadly. Sue, your work, and more specifically your most recent book, Women in Work, which I'm really pleased to hear has been translated in at least 3 languages. So congratulations on that. Has also fueled the writing of this book and the way that it's located within social reproduction studies. I was already researching different childcare workers movement in Australia and elsewhere, but it's your particular formulation of a social reproduction theory that tries to take both exploitation and identity-based oppression seriously. So that tries to bring together struggles in communities and struggles in workplaces together, rather than trying to see them as in a hierarchy or as more or less important. That really helped me to unpack how maternal worker power, what that would look like. And I think that's something that's ongoing and something I still have a lot of questions about, because I didn't, for this particular project, I didn't talk to you could say unwaged maternal workers. I didn't talk to, I didn't go into women's homes or visit parks. It wasn't that sort of an empirical project. So thank you to all 3 of you for enabling me to sort of think about maternal workers in this way. Okay, broader anti-capitalist politics and confrontation. Wow. I think I was trying to think when I was writing the very last parts of the book about how holding states and local governments and employers to account would form part of those strategies. So in that final chapter, there's a section called Childcare Struggles as Threat. So what sort of threats are coalitions able to deploy to make to hold those actors to account when the levels of depletions are so high that they end up the sort of incidents that Helen recounted in her address described. So I found that the terminology of threat and depletion and being able to embed depletion into legal frameworks as particularly useful. But that's still something that I need to think more about. I think the question of NGOs and their contradictory position is really difficult to answer comprehensively, because I was really basing my argument there on the fieldwork that I did in Bristol, and Bristol has a specific history of parent organizing by anti-poverty and anti-racist parent organizing that isn't necessarily, and that has connections with the shape of the NGO sector today, but I don't think that necessarily is the case in other cities. And of course, those organizations have massively changed since they were, some of them, set up in the 1980s and 1970s. But my colleague in French, Roy, is here, and she is an expert on NGOs and precisely that question. So I'm hoping that maybe she can join the conversation at some point. The question of children, again, I haven't addressed this in this book for sure, but I think that's something that I'd like to turn my attention to next. And I'm reminded of one of the, I think in a recent article that Helen co-authored, she writes about children as the biggest losers, so I think thinking about children as actors, as actors in those struggles is really important, and I'm looking forward to sort of hearing more, because I know that you've been writing about childhood and social reproduction, to what that what that could look like. So yeah, I think I'm going to leave my comments there, and so we have time for others to join.
Great, thank you, Maud. And is any of the speakers would like to respond, or is it okay to open to the floors, the audience, to have any comment and questions? If any of you want to have a quick response to Maud's comment.
Can I just have a quick one?
Of course.
So that I can apologize, because I'm going to have to leave because I've got something I can't miss. But yeah, Maud, so I was really interested in your response to Junko's question, and I wondered whether, because when I was reading it, I kept thinking about filial worker. I feel like I'm a filial worker now rather than a maternal worker. So I was wondering kind of, so this isn't really a question, it's just the beginning of a conversation, so I was thinking, oh, well, so I just wonder whether maternal worker, I wonder whether we could push that in different directions. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to dash off.
Thank you, Bridget.
Thank you, Bridget.